Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Today, just a few housekeeping rules for you. We're going to ask you to stay muted unless called upon. To speak, polls will pop up on your screen. You just click the response that best represents your opinion. To ask a question, please type your name into the chat tool. And this session will be recorded, and this presentation will be made available post-event. With that, I'm going to hand this over to Bernie, our host and interviewer for today, and Vice President of the CMC Ontario Institute. Take it away, Bernie.
Hi, thank you. Welcome everybody to the next in our series of the Disruptive Trends in Practice Development Leadership Series hosted by the Ontario Institute. I'm Bernie Ulick, and this is another sold out event, and we have people from all across the country here, Alberta, British Columbia. We've got somebody from Nunavut, Quebec, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, etc. So that's it's great. It's amazing how interesting people are in the concepts of data. So the goals of our sessions here again are to provide you with some actionable topics and tips and techniques, things that can help you grow your practice. The four main things that we want to cover off today in our conversation with Ron is going to be around data. What business information and data management is today, how to identify the right problem that your client is facing and the challenges and opportunities in dealing with large, complicated data, how you can leverage that and to get better deployments. And finally, we want to make sure that you walk away with a sustainable framework that you can use to managing those data issues. So with that, I'm going to introduce our guest, Ron Schwartz of Adante Consulting. He's an expert and champion in leveraging data successfully for this. One other thing we're going to use here is we're going to use the chat feature, which we have available and turned on, so that if you have any questions throughout the discussion, feel free to type it into the chat. We'll be monitoring that and inject those questions into the conversation as we go, and then we'll have a bigger Q&A at the end of the whole exercise. So hi, Ron, and let me just say hi, and maybe you'd like to start with just introduce yourself and give us a bit of an idea of what's got you interested in this topic of data and all that jazz.
So, hey, Bernie, thanks. Pleasure to be here, and it's a delight to have a bit of an audience to talk about the subject, because I think we've been struggling a little bit with how to make this a bit of a broader access kind of conversation. So I think that we're pretty happy with how this is all playing itself out. We've always been we've been a small boutique consulting firm for a long time, and we were doing some strategy work a bunch of years ago, and we told one of our insurance company clients, they were a mid-sized firm, they needed to grow. They needed to grow for a whole bunch of reasons. They needed capital down the road. We could see a lot of stuff coming down the pipe. They needed to be more in control of their own destiny. They needed better deals with reinsurers. They needed a whole bunch of things that were important from their point of view. And they said, great strategy. After we were done with the strategy project, you got to help us implement it, and we got to figure out where to start. And we said, so let's start with what products and what lines are working really well for you. And they looked at us a little funny. And they said, you know, we've been wondering that too. We have some hunches. We have some theories. But before we spend bazillions of dollars, there's got to be a way to test that. So this is about 8 years ago, and we started down that road a little bit. And about 2 years later, we were doing some serious business intelligence for them, and we kind of helped them reshape their strategy on very hardcore stuff. Today, they've doubled in size, shifted their focus, and moved to a place where they're very successful. So there's no doubt in my mind, data wins. But I think that that's kind of how we got into it, Bernie. There's a longer story than that, and I could tell you more of it, but you know, that's kind of the quick view of kind of where we took a bit of a left turn from pure strategy into hardcore data. And we've kind of been deeper and deeper ever since.
Good. Well, we wanted to get a bit of an understanding of our audience as well, so we put together a little quick poll for everybody to participate in here. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a look at your screens, and there's a question there of the top 3 things you want to get out of this session. That'll help Ron and I gauge which direction we want to take the conversation. So if you just want to take a couple of seconds to give us an idea, and it's multiple choice, you can pick multiples. I think it's pretty much settling down now. So you got a good handle on that there, Ron?
Yeah, so data and strategy and digital transformation. So these are some of my favorite topics.
Okay, great. So let's move on to the first question then, which I've got here is, what is data management and why is it important now?
So I think we're behind on a slide, by the way. I think
Yep.
we've got a, I don't know, there we go. So why now? Why now? So I think we think data is always important. I'm just gonna, wait, I gotta cancel something here. I've got the poll all over my screen. There we go. COVID has turned our world on its head. And I think that in a world where Hertz is in bankruptcy, in a world where that was not imaginable 3 months ago, retailers who are challenged have had their woes accelerate on them. Airlines have seen their revenues go to zero. You just sort of look at what's going on and you just know that when companies come back, they're going to need to come back different. They're going to have different markets. They're going to be slower to recover in some places, quicker in other places. And one of the things that can tilt the playing field, and it's really important to us, is figuring out how to exploit the data to help you to figure out what to do, what's most important, how you get that done right. So I think that it's really become important now, partly because of this. What we're looking at on the screen kind of highlights it a little bit. This is the Johns Hopkins dashboard, and Johns Hopkins is tracking every single case of COVID in the world. It's kind of recorded, you can see in the bottom middle, about 188 countries. It's recorded 6.67 million confirmed cases, 375,000 deaths. We know what country they're in, we know where they are, we know where things are accelerating. And this is the class of data that national governments are using to evaluate as a benchmark their performance, to evaluate their economies as they close and open things, to understand what's flattening the curve. You can see in the bottom right, there's kind of an active daily cases curve, and the global cases are climbing. They're not going up so much in Europe or in Canada, but they're going up dramatically in South America. They're going up dramatically in Africa. Those are places where you do business. That's a big deal. So I think that especially if you're a global business or a large business, this data becomes important. And I actually will tell you something a little bit later in the session about what we're doing about that. But I think that this data becomes important. But the general idea of data is that it's going to be even harder in the next normal, whatever that is, for us to rise above and figure out how to be successful. So data, really important.
Great. So I think here, I mean, it's certainly a compelling story of the ability and the power of being able to take a lot of information from different places, put it together and do something with it. And I know that's something a lot of companies struggle with. So what kind of problems do your clients that you see in the marketplace there have that would trigger them to want to do more work with data?
So when we talk to clients, the first job we're trying to figure out is what's actually the thing they want help with. And that's a really interesting problem by itself, because the word data is so broad, has become so broad and mangled into so many things, whether it's analytics or data science or artificial intelligence or predictive models, or it's all about trying to figure out what data will help, what information will be helpful. And so we kind of think about this, and this is something of a different take on a maturity model, but we evaluate really on 2 dimensions when we're trying to figure out how to help a client. And we don't ask these questions exactly, but we ask questions that get us to this. We're trying to figure out what is the clarity of the client's concept and what is their ability to execute. How much do they know what they want and need, and how much of that can they do? And those two things help us a little bit to figure it out. If they have no idea what they want and they have no ability to execute it, they're really in the we don't know what we don't know space, and we loosely call that uninformed, though we don't actually show this to people quite the same way. If they're really smart about their concept and their plan, and they have tremendous capability to execute, they may be top right, very advanced, maybe using AI, probably reaping benefits. But everybody else is in a place where they're struggling with something. They're struggling to get more clarity of their plan. They're struggling to get more capability to execute. And they're struggling to move upwards a little bit in some, upwards or out in some dimension. And I think this is kind of a little bit of the way we think about it, and asking the question. So I think that that's kind of a starting point for how we assess where they're at, and really what problem will help them the most in terms of getting a solution to.
So what type of a project is this typically with your customers, and what are some of their common goals that get them launched down this path?
So you're asking about projects, and it's good to maybe, I think the next slide talks about how we look at the problems in terms of, we have a bit of a methodology.
Okay.
And I'm gonna take a minute and pause on one of the boxes here, because it gets at one of the questions about reliability of data that's in the chat box. But while the projects are often specialized, an insurance company wants to know things about how to lower its loss ratios. A credit card company may want to know about how to reduce fraud, or it may want to know about how to get more credit cards out there and better marketing, or it may want to, or an airline might want to know about how to exploit better trends as a result of their loyalty program. So the projects are all specialized, but they fall into one of several buckets. Sometimes the project is an advisory project. We're producing a report. We're helping them to figure out what strategy is, what their data approach is. Maybe it's governance. Maybe there's a bunch of issues that have come up as a result of something, and they need to wrap their minds back around it. I'm going to jump to the middle. I'm going to come back to that second box in a moment. But maybe what they need is BI, business intelligence. They need shared information in front of everybody so that everybody has exactly the same data, everybody has exactly the best information, and everybody can figure out what to do to go forward with it. There's drill down, there's a whole bunch of things going on in there that are important, but I think at the heart, these are about making management smarter. When you get into the business of making transactions go faster, typically you're into the place of models and predictions, though this bleeds a little bit back into some of the BI bit. And the models and the predictions are really about what price will make a person on your website buy for this transaction. What can we detect about whether or not this transaction is likely fraudulent in real time? What can we detect about, one of our clients was a bank, and they were trying to figure out how to broaden their reach in marketing. So they were trying to market some of their different products and roll out a bit of a schedule to promote different products to different audiences. And there was a complex job to figure out which of their many clients would be likely to accept certain kinds of offers, who wanted a line of credit, who wanted mortgage, some help, a bunch of things like that. This is a little bit pre-COVID. And eventually, some of these projects get folded into or get started from a larger transformation initiative. We need to be able to do X in 3, 4, 5, 6 years. We need to have highly automated this. We need to have something that rolls out. We need to be able to play in the digital delivery, very fast, full transaction, data automated model. And we need to think through how we get there. And those projects are about piling projects on in terms of really the sequencing of projects in the digital transformation initiative. I want to come back to that second box, turning raw data into useful data. Raw data is typically, it's just raw data. To make it useful, you know, most of our ERP systems, most of the core systems that are at work in companies have very complex data structures. And that raw data is very important because it's the underlying stuff, but it's very hard. You know, it's very hard in one of our clients just to figure out how many clients they had. They prepare in their core system a lot of quotes for people, and they show up as clients. Many of those are never realized, and it's not a trivial thing to figure out which were actual clients, which were clients for a week but no longer, which in one of our insurance companies, you know, they may have had X policies last year. How many of them renewed and how many of this year's are new, and how many of those new people are people who've come back? So it turns out useful data, it depends on the question you're trying to ask. But this raw data to useful data stuff is about plumbing. It's about validating. It's about building checks in. It's about making sure that the data that comes out that you're calling useful has been reconciled and can be reconciled continuously. There's a whole lot of steps in the plumbing stuff that sometimes you can do on the fly when you're doing BI. Sometimes you can do on the fly when you're doing models. And sometimes it gets big enough in a real company that you actually have to stop, build a data warehouse, you have to get it together, and you have to do a whole bunch of other things, maybe data marts for the marketing people to have good data. So there's a whole bunch of steps here, and understanding the scale of that problem and understanding what's in there is kind of how we make data reliable.
Okay. You also had a bit of a case study that you wanted to talk at a little bit that was quite effective.
Yeah, so we'll talk this through a little bit. We spend a lot of time in some of our workshops on this because it really helps people to understand it. There's a lot of boxes here. I'm not going to talk about all of them. This is a breakdown of the functional capabilities that exist in Amazon's same-day delivery feature. Some people have heard me talk about this before. But when Amazon promises to do same-day delivery for a book, say, it turns out there's an awful lot going on behind the scenes. There's an app at the top that says, top left, that says, I don't know if people can see a mouse here. I don't really know that I have a pointer necessarily. I don't want to take charge of the screen, Bernie.
Yeah.
But I think that there's kind of an app that says, how do you find and order it? And you're going to give up on the app if the app doesn't really help you find the book you're looking for really fast. And for Amazon, that's an interesting challenge because they have 500 million products you might be looking for on that app. So helping you to find the book you're looking for or the thing you're looking for really fast on that app, even though you might have misspelled it, is a critical capability. There's a little bit of search, a little bit of display stuff because it wants to maybe give you some options, but the likeliest ones have to be at the top. And that all has to happen in tenths of a second. So there's a question here about what AI is. And artificial intelligence is, in the sense that we worry about it mostly, artificial intelligence, maybe as a word, is used in two different ways. I'll come back to the second way in a few moments. It's a very general kind of loosey-goosey, hey, we'll build artificially intelligent systems one day. I think what we're trying to figure out is how to exploit knowledge that we don't have to program through rules. And that's what really the scope for us of machine learning. And so we can't teach a computer by rules. To say if a person made this move in this game, do this for some very complicated games. So we need a different way. And those techniques are in the family of machine learning. And some of them are really what we consider to be the underpinnings of artificial intelligence methods. So AI, we would often use those to interpret images. We would use those to interpret audio. We would use those to translate language. We would use those to do lots of things that are very complex, higher order functions, can't do with calculations. And we would do them here in the narrow thing to help find the thing we think you're searching for. We'd know if you were a person who bought books from us. We'd know if that's what we needed to show. And that's an example of what do we need to know and know how to do. If we can find it, then there's a whole bunch of things going on that help you to buy it, like Amazon's one-click ordering, and they know about your Prime membership, and they know they have your credit card, presumably because you trust Amazon security. So there's a whole lot of things going on, and that's all in the guise of get the order. Then Amazon has to deliver on the same day. And that really means they have to have the right stuff in a forward storage warehouse. They have to be able to find it and pack it and ship it in under a few hours. And it has to be in transit for less than a few hours. So you can't have manual interventions in this system if you want this to work. You just need this to go. The only thing people have to be able to do here that is somehow manual is pick and pack, drop it into something, get it boxed, and then get it into the delivery person's hands so they can get it out to you in the right number of hours. Everything else has to be automated. So I think there's a view here that says we have to engineer a process. And it's important when you think about this from a digital transformation point of view, if someone else were trying to build this, they'd need comparable boxes and comparable capabilities in every area. So you start to look at this and you say, this is kind of how you think about a transformed scenario by exploding it backwards from a single use case, which is same day delivery. So we like to work through use cases. We like to work through examples. We like to work through what does it take to make this really work. And if you're trying to do all this, you have a several-year digital transformation project because you have a loyalty program and you have a this and you have a that. But it's why we like the case study approach so much. It's why it helps us to break the problem down and say, let's do these two things next year. Do these, they will be good by themselves. If you can build this and get that running, that will be very good.
Great. It's an excellent view on the case study. Deja vu for me as well. I remember setting this up for Indigo Chapters about 5 years ago, putting their thing and how all these bits and pieces come together. So it actually does work, and it is a lot of work. What are some of the key lessons learned that you think we should be sharing with the audience here out of this exercise?
So I think that it goes back to what problem are you trying to solve for a client? What requirement, what will really help them move the needle in some important way? And it's useful to know what the end game is in this sense, but it's more useful in the sense of the next 2 or 3 months or 6 months of data or projects to think about it in terms of the methodology buckets. In terms of what projects are we going to tackle, because it turns out each of them requires slightly different skills, slightly different skill sets. There's a whole bunch of conversations that relate to that. So I would say define the projects clearly. I would say that's probably the most important lesson. Make sure each project conceptually is doable, and it's not, there's that famous chart that I actually am to say it. I wish we had it here, of this really complex mathematical formula just before the output, and then the little last bubble before the output is, and then a miracle occurs. Right? If that's your strategy, it's a bit problematic, right?
Okay. On the, so this is great now. From a consulting perspective, how do you go about selling this now? What's your proposal there?
So when you're talking to a client and you're trying to figure out, we go back to that 2-dimensional matrix. Sometimes we're selling skills into a client. They know what they want to do, but they don't have the manpower to do it. Sometimes they don't really have a plan yet, and they need a plan. Sometimes they have a project that they want to articulate, and they need help to get that framed, organized, and done, and it includes data, and it includes a bunch of things. So we were doing some work for one of the big banks, and I would say the big bank was a very sophisticated consumer of our skills. They have their act together, but like every really big organization, they have some neglected subdivisions, some smaller divisions that just can't get the attention of the central IT functions or the central data functions or the center of excellence that worries about a lot of the analytics. And these divisions were responsible for, a couple of $1 billion of revenues, but they were small compared to the main part of the big bank. And so they just couldn't get any attention. They just needed help building a series of operating dashboards that helped the managers across those divisions to run their business better. We did that with just dashboards and skills and people we provided on a subcontract. Sometimes we take on a project where one of our insurance companies needed a predictive model that said, we need to figure out how in places where we have never written insurance before, whether we are likely to be successful in that area or not at pricing well. And we said, actually, we can help you do that. We understand how to do that. We know what you're really good at, and we can find places where there's lots of the markets you're really good at and lots of the markets you're not so good at. And that was a complex job for us to blend a lot of census data, statistics together, their history, a lot of geocoding of stuff. So big project in the sense, but easy for us to define a scope, self-contain it. And on the other hand, sometimes the work is really advisory. We need coaching, or we need something else, or you need a different set of skills. And so I think that from our point of view, it's really about thinking through what moves the needle forward for our client. In the data space for us, we have a very high degree of, we have a broad range of tools, but I think that what we choose and what we want to bring to bear has to be whatever it is helps them and they can implement.
Okay. So that's good there. I like the concept that how to go about selling that. What do you see as some of the common complexities that people have in being able to sell these projects or launching a project like that?
I think we have a couple of slides here about tools and skills, right?
Yeah, the next one I think is skills.
Let's start with skills. The problem really is, depending on the project, you need some combination of these 3 buckets of skills. And these 3 buckets of skills each encompass a lot of different skills. But some of it is about tools and applications and understanding the core system and understanding how to reconcile data and understanding a bunch of, how to build something. Sometimes it's about understanding what is a good forecasting methodology. Sometimes it's about understanding time series analysis in the algorithms and methods category. Sometimes it's about machine learning. And in every case, it works better if you know what business problem you're solving. You can figure out how to do that. So the short answer for us is we can't really find anybody who has all 3 in spades. People who are deep at all 3, they don't exist. That's why we call them unicorns, right? Because really unicorns, not so much. And so what we really have to do is we have to blend these 3 things together by having some of our methods and algorithms guys work with the data plumbing guys or the tools people who are often working with either other consultants or our clients, often on the business half. And those things together really, that's job 1, is knowing how to partition a job. And I think there's a real thing going on about how we put these skills together. So I think that's a piece of the answer to your question. And the other part is a little bit into tools. And the problem with tools is there are a billion tools. It's like nonsensical how many tools there are that will advertise to you that they can solve all of your problems. And so trying to chase tools turns out to be the wrong way to come at the problem. You need really good mastery of a dozen or so of these tools. And then in a bunch of specific scenarios, you need to embellish your tool set so that you can build a comprehensive stack. And these are some of the things that we have in that first top left bucket on the slide before about tools. Which tools do you know? Which tools do you use? And in a world where, if your tools are Excel today, you don't know what you don't know about what more modern tools do. Excel could not produce or manage or maintain the data that the COVID dashboard was displaying for a bunch of reasons. It doesn't allow you the drill down. It doesn't allow you the focus. It doesn't allow you the flexibility. And if that's your tool, then you are limited by what your tool can do and what you know about how to use it. Other tools will change what the scope of your model could be, your approach could be. So I think that there's a combination of skills and tools that help us to shape the job quite a bit, but I think that they inform the conversation for us about what the project is.
Okay. So that's a good segue into the next question that we've got here is, there's a lot of things to be done here. So how do you propose, what are the things that people should do to learn more about this and to get more engaged and get comfortable of selling and developing these types of opportunities?
So I think this is an audience of consultants, and we love working with consultants, right? Because I think that the core issue for us is the business knowledge is really critical to success, and we can't possibly do all of the business stuff on these jobs with a broad range of clients. So we are always looking for people to collaborate with who bring lots of business knowledge. So I think that, I'm going to come back to this conversation in a moment, and when I touch on that third box, which is partner. But I want to, some of you will say, hey, wait, these are interesting, and I kind of recognize some of these challenges in some of my clients, and they know what to go talk to them about, and they have some skills, and maybe I can help them frame a job. And, there's a way to do a bit of a deeper dive, and this might be a good starting point for some people to go off and do their own work, full stop. Certainly it will help people in that vein to have good language and better structure about framing the job and understanding that. And we're good with that because there's so much to do. But I think there's also something we're going to offer, because I think that as we try to raise the game a little bit, we're going to actually structure a full day masterclass that we're likely to offer, not for free as it turns out, but a complete framework that really dives into those 5 areas we were talking about and spends a little bit of time diving into what is raw data to useful data, what is BI, what are models and predictions, and how do we get really good at talking about those kinds of things? How does that integrate into data transformation? What do advisory jobs look like? And those are kind of what we see in those kind of 5 chevrons off to the side. So we're probably going to do that later in July for people who are trying to figure out how to do more with that. But also, I think that there's a lot of ways we look at the range of jobs that are out there, and we have as a boutique consultancy, we have some real depth in the work that is getting the data right, but making it really useful and fit for purpose requires a level of business contribution that I find we actually partner with a lot. So I think we turn out to be a very good partner for people who want to say, if I can find a job, can we work together to do it? And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to sit back and say, on that level, also for people who are trying to get into it, while we already have a pretty good stable of resources, we're always looking to enhance that too. So I think there's a bunch of obvious ways to partner with us, and we're quite open to a bunch of other connections too. So I think that from my point of view, this is it's kind of there's an interesting way to get at this. So partner with us, take the master class. And I would say if you're interested in the master class, we're going to ask you about that later. So I think that we'll ask you to maybe give us here through the chat, well, maybe through responding, some kind of feedback on that. You have we're talking about that a little bit.
Yeah, good. I think too, for consultants to be successful, so it looks like there's some things you can do in your own, but things where you need to dive deeper to really get a good solid understanding. And I see from some of the questions we can get to in a minute that people have a question of, how far can they go and what do they need to do? So maybe just summarize a little bit of what this master class would look like that you're proposing to push forward from there. And we'll be offering that as well. We're looking at putting something together in July. We'll have a question for everybody at the end of who would be interested and what time frame so that we can structure around that. So maybe just a quick nickel tour on what the what this master class would look like.
So I think that the first category, Bernie, is the data and strategy piece, and these are advisory gigs. In one form or another, the result of most of these are diagnostics or advisory reports or plans. And I think what we do is a bit of a deep dive into what is a good toolkit if you're trying to figure out how to offer that as a service, full stop. Mm-hmm. In terms of raw data to useful data, we are huge proponents of automating as much as can be automated. We're pretty good at figuring out where those limits are, but those limits are typically much farther out than most people imagine. We are able to automate much, much more than I think most people who aren't familiar with this and haven't been doing it for years would think through on first blush. The BI piece is, really kind of interesting to us. It's about dashboards, it's about drill down, it's about shared knowledge, it's about being able to take the right data out into Excel to do some further analysis if that's useful. It's about how you develop the skills as a storyteller. It's about how you serve the data leadership and executive team. And mostly what most of the BI stuff is about is making people smarter in your client organization. Most of the outcomes are, we're giving you data so you know more about what's going on. Maybe you know your clients better. Maybe you can identify categories of fraud that you weren't looking for before. They're really about making people smarter. Sometimes models and predictions are about that too. We try to figure out which kinds of things are something. But typically, there's a wide range of algorithms in the model and prediction space. And it's useful to have an understanding of what's a classification algorithm, what's an actual machine learning method. There's a whole lot of, thinking through what the best way to solve a problem might be. Every model requires extensive customized data. So I think that there's a combination of data slinging skills that we borrow from the raw to useful data package to make data for models and predictions. But fundamentally, what we're trying to do is automated intervention in systems so that we can produce the right price on the website for the person we want to sell something to, or the right recommendations in Amazon's recommendation engine, so you're likelier to buy something, or maybe upsell when they think you need actually the better thing. So there's a whole bunch of, what's the model and prediction scope? And then digital transformation is usually roadmap stuff, multiple projects, program agendas, and it's about delivering transformational capabilities over a period of time. And the masterclass for us is about spending really a bit of an hour, often in a case study approach, but in a bit of an interactive approach also, how you can apply this. So I think that there's a bunch of tools that, you know, kind of are really useful tucked away in each of these buckets. And you can't really, you know, I hope I've convinced you we couldn't do justice to this in an hour, but we can start to do justice to it in an hour per topic. So.
Okay, good. So as we move through this, as we get ready to open up for the questions from the audience here, what are some of the key questions? I think you've developed a list of questions that might be things that your clients raise that you can answer and help them up their game. So do you maybe just want to address these, and then we'll go into the Q&A from the audience?
Yeah, I think we've talked a little bit about some of these already. I'm going to talk about the second one, because the second one is a common problem. We do a lot of work with mid-sized companies. We do some work with really quite large companies like the banks, but I think that in those cases, we're doing specific clear projects. But the kind of questions mid-sized companies have for us are things like this second question. My client has crappy data. Can I still help them? Can we do something with it? One of our clients had sell stuff on the web across the country. People entered their own addresses in the course of stuff, and they were trying to figure out where people came from. And some of the data was okay, but about 60% of their data had cities that weren't really decipherable. 60% of the data, over 60% of the data was not decipherable. And the 40% wasn't really representative because it was very heavily representative of places like Toronto. They sold the financial services product on the web. And we looked at that and we said, so you have 60% unusable city data. I bet you we could figure out what most of these cities were. When we start looking at this, we can work backwards from postal codes. We can do some mapping. Sometimes the postal codes were wrong, but in any event, we could actually decode the cities. What we found that there were about 84 different ways to spell Mississauga. It startled us. Okay, Mississauga is a bit of a complicated word, but really 84 ways to misspell it. And so we actually developed a little small piece of AI that does city name correction for Canadian cities. And it's become kind of a little layered tool in their application set that, you know, it turned out it was really hard in their core system to fix city names at source. So we repair it on the way in, and suddenly they have 98% accuracy in city names validated against postal codes, so they can actually figure out where their clients are really coming from. So yeah, our client had crappy data, but we could still do something with that. It turns out it's a difficult raw data to useful data transformation, but I think that it's a really kind of example. So I think that, you know, they had 1 million addresses over a lot of years. 40% of them were right. We kind of were interested in, you know, how that worked. And it turns out we really helped them a lot with that little problem. And that was a small piece of the work we were doing to help them kind of do BI. So crappy data has to be looked at a little bit in context to say, that doesn't mean it's a zero. It means it's something else. We may need to be able to do something. We may be able to do something with that.
That might even address now. Let's open it up to the general questions here. And I'm looking at the chat list here.
Sure.
So on that same theme is, what if the clients have the wrong data or data that are not enough? How do you navigate around that to still achieve the objectives of the analysis?
So not enough. I think that very few people actually have that problem. We do a lot of work. Of course, one of the big buzzwords these days is big data. We jokingly say internally, we do a lot of work with small data. I think that there are a lot of people who have a lot of data that is hard for them to master and use. And I think we've kind of figured out a lot about what it takes to work with that. You clearly can't do some things without, but you're not trying to do big data things typically with smaller data sets. You're trying to figure out how to optimize something over, a few 100,000 of these or a few 100,000 of those. We have a client that sells up about 50,000 SKUs a year. Actually about 4,000 SKUs, about 50,000 sales a year. And we've just done a pricing optimization for them on this data set, because across 4,000 SKUs and lots of contracts that they could offer the pricing, different prices under, it was very hard for them to figure out how to optimize revenue. So pricing simulation on things that are in the tens of thousands sometimes and worth doing it. And we found them a few extra $1 million of revenue by some simple price changes.
Caroline has a question here that says, I'd be curious to know about what immediate post-COVID effect applications you see or anticipate for clients.
So I'm going to tell you about one thing we're actually going to launch in about 10 days, because I think it's really topical for us. We have gotten to understand a little bit of the COVID data because we're so data centric. And one of the things that's very clear to us is there will be next waves. And more to the point, every single jurisdiction is going to be different. It may be this way in Michigan, it may be that way in Florida, it may be this way in Ontario, it may be that way in New Brunswick. Toronto might care about this. It might be exploding out of control in South America while it's coming under control somewhere else. Every jurisdiction is going to be different. And one of the things that we're rolling out to our clients is we've been asked for a little bit is, can we look forward based on what's actually happening today and forecast a little bit what might be happening in 30 to 60 days based on current data and trends, and to help planners in medium-sized or larger organizations operating on multiple jurisdictions figure out how to organize themselves across the multiple jurisdictions. Which ones are likely to be very problematic, which ones are likely to be much less problematic, because it goes to, from the planning point of view, capital allocation. So in the very short term, we're actually probably going to roll something, we're going to roll something like that out. And it may take a few iterations to get it perfect, but I think that we have enough data now, we already know, to provide a very interesting and useful medium-term horizon that helps people do a little bit of forward looking. So there's an example of how do we take data, make it very short-term useful. I see that there's a question here. One of the people asked a question about, wait, why should anybody really do this if they're desperately trying to stave off bankruptcy? And I think the short answer to that is they should stave off bankruptcy first rather than taking on something new. But if they're concerned about what they'll be offering in a year's time, then what they're likely to be offering in a year's time might be a different conversation than what they were offering 6 months ago. And it might be a little different, and they might need to be a little smarter. So there's a break point somewhere. If you're really desperately trying to hang on by your fingernails, you got to do that first. If you are in a place where what you do next year needs to be a little different from what you did 6 months ago, then maybe there are staged projects here that help you a little bit to move along that way.
Okay, here's another question too on the public sector from Mayanak. In what areas can we leverage BI in the public sector organizations to better provide services to the public? And can you share any use cases or case studies for the public sector applications?
So this is a good area for us to partner, by the way. We do a lot of work indirectly through partners to the public sector, but I think that there's the public sector space is, I mean, I spent a lot of my life in the public sector space. When I was at PwC, in Ottawa, we did a lot of work. All of our work was actually federal government. So I think that, so it's a space I really understand. The data that you need to operate in the public sector space is more complex and nuanced. It's not profit. It may be numbers in the sense of number of participants or program spend or a bunch of different attributes of it, but it's also often outcomes. And so I think that the measurement of a lot of these pieces is something that I think harmonizing the data, bringing the data together, developing prototype dashboards, having a conversation about what's the most useful thing that would move this agenda forward very quickly would be a very useful kind of conversation. And I think that individual case studies are maybe a bit long to get into in terms of an answer, but I think that's kind of there's absolutely a conversation there about when you're looking at things in the whole, you know, in a sense, the entire economic response to the COVID virus scenario is a public sector application of kind of managing and social distancing in order to manage simultaneously limiting the economic damage while not overtaxing the health system. And those are exactly the kinds of complex choices that I think data can help inform. So I think that without being too, you know, too directed on this, I think that's a real thing. There's so many use cases.
Okay. Here's another question from Marilyn. I'm expanding my consulting business to offer leadership and executive coaching. I want to be able to use data more effectively to evaluate the impact of coaching. Also in her work in strategy consulting, how do you get a better handle on how to use data more effectively?
Yeah, so I think that there's a workshop we hold as part of our digital transformation piece that I think we could talk about separately, but it really goes to a conversation with clients about what digital capabilities would move the needle for you. And if you can start to get a view of what the capabilities are, then I think people who know how it's done might be able to help you to figure out what a roadmap looks like a little bit. And so I think the first step when you're trying to figure out what should be done may be a diagnostic, it may be a planning engagement, it may be a report. It's probably not diving in. Sometimes what we do in our first engagements, even when it's planning, is we do a bit of a diagnostic on the actual data itself to see if inferences we can imagine should exist actually do exist. One of our clients sells courses, and they sell them kind of one-off over every couple of years to some of the same people. And their question was, could we develop a multi-year client profile to improve our marketing? And we said, actually, we don't know. Let us look at your data. And we spent about 4 days looking at their data and determined, oh yeah, absolutely. But you got to spend it's a couple of days of hardcore looking at complex ERP class tables that have to be joined. Could you really develop? And these are reports no one's ever thought about developing before, effectively.
Yeah, I guess the big question here too, and I see this as a next question here, but what I've seen is that, you know, people always wonder is, what do I do with all this data? So it's not just extracting the data and producing reports. Data, and it's not the extraction process, it's then actually doing something with it, using your brain to look at it from different points of view. The tools give you the ability of looking at it and slicing it this way, what about that? Putting together pieces of data that didn't connect before. And that's how you get to the aha versus just, okay, I know what our sales were and I know that they're more or less, but it's you start getting insight by the fact that you can put these things together. Here's another question from Anne, a similar vein. The discussion are in the context of large organizations. Can this be adapted for small organizations?
Yeah, we do a lot of, well, so small. Here's the thing about small, right? I mean, I think that it depends on how small. I think it's hard to get access to expertise in really tiny jobs. So if the organization doesn't actually have some kind of opportunity to have a consulting budget or a services spend, then it's hard to figure out how to help them really, other than to say good luck and here's some places you might go looking. But I think they're going to have to spend money on that anyways in one form or another in terms of their own people, and they won't have the people because we looked at the list of skills before, and when you dig into the list of skills, it's a bit trickier. So really small, it's hard. But medium-sized organizations for us, start with, it's hard, if you can do something in $10,000 and $25,000 jobs, then I think that there's a bit of an opportunity to start to really help someone. So that's absolutely in the space of medium-sized and even SMEs really that are bigger than tiny companies. So I think once you're over a certain size and you can afford a bit of a spend, then I think that it turns out you can typically do way more with your data than you know. So I think that there's getting someone who knows what to do with that on your advisory team in one form or another might help you frame the job, and then you get to spend maybe a little bit of the money doing some of that work, and that probably helps a little bit too. So I think that's another way we can collaborate a little bit, especially on medium-sized gigs, medium-sized client gigs.
Okay. Last question here, I think, from David is, what criteria do you use to determine whether the task should be automated or performed by a person? What are the current limits of AI? And that links into another question of here is, how do you figure out not losing touch of the human side of things when you automate some of these processes? So
not losing the human touch is a real thing that I think you have to think about almost at the kind of enterprise level in terms of what you're trying to automate. It's a struggle. Often as you move towards digital transformation, you have to figure out what you want your people involved with and what you don't want your people involved with, what you can and should routinize or automate, and what you probably maybe could but should not along the way. So there's some of those kinds of questions about what could or should. There is on the first half of the question, how much can be automated and how reliable is it and how much do we trust it, which is kind of how I remember hearing the question.
Yeah.
It turns out the tools we have in AI and the methods we use in machine learning are actually pretty good at helping us to understand the rates at which they predict correctly. The rates at which they produce false positives and false negatives. This is something we dive into a bit in the masterclass. So I think that we end up with a conversation where we understand whether a predicted outcome matches an actual outcome, and whether or not, and if it doesn't, what went wrong. And that's an actual analyzable kind of, it's called a confusion matrix, about how to look at that, and you can look that up. But I think the confusion matrix as a tool, as a class of tools, really helps you to understand how good your predictions are. So it's not like I've written an algorithm and it says this and you have to go. And you have to bet the farm on that. We can actually tell you, and we can calibrate the algorithm, and we can do a whole bunch of things that make it better and better and better every single time. And we can know when we've stopped making it better. And that, it turns out, is a pretty important piece of knowledge in the machine learning space that helps us to do that. That's why we call it data science, maybe. And that's probably a good number, as opposed to data guessing, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with that, I think we need to wind it down here. So I think on behalf of the audience and CMC Canada and the Ontario Institute, thank Ron for taking the time to inspire us with this. I've got a couple of quick takeaways, which is understand your problem, make sure you got a clear focus before you go in. And also, if you are comfortable and you want to pursue this some more, there's some education and training that's available. And so if you need to connect up with Ron, there's his information available on the site. There's also more information on our website. And please note that as we move forward, we're putting together a master class. We're looking at potentially something in July if there's an interest in the audience based on the summertime. But if there's an interest, then there's a chance that we'll put together a master class in July, and also probably one in the September timeframe. So please send your information to contact or info@CMC Canada or ontario.ca. It's on the screen here if I could read it. And we'll also be sending out a quick survey to gauge your interest and your information, as well as what you thought about this webinar and the ongoing webinars as we move forward. So again, thank you very much, Ron. Thank you very much to the audience, and hope you enjoyed and took away some good tips and techniques.
And thank you, Bernie and Sandra, too, for all this. And everybody stay well.